Hello everyone, I'm John, and welcome back to another whispered true crime story shared softly to calm your mind while revealing the hidden dangers of real life. These are not just stories to pass the time, they are true events, and each one carries a lesson. I don't want you to only listen. I want you to learn so you never fall into the same traps, so you never become the next victim. Share this with your family and friends because protecting them may start with something as simple as this story. And I know many of you use these whispers to fall asleep, but before you drift away, please take a moment to subscribe, like, and share. It may feel small, but it's the only way this channel survives and the only reason I can keep whispering these true cases night after night. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? I love seeing how far these whispers travel across the world, so don't put it off until tomorrow. Do it now, before sleep takes you away. Now relax, slow your breathing, and let's begin tonight's case. Story 1. In February 2008, the town of Dewsbury in West Yorkshire became the centre of a mystery that no one could ignore. Just 9 months earlier, the world had been shaken by the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, a 3-year-old girl who vanished during a family holiday in Portugal. Her case became one of the most famous missing child stories in the world. So when another young English girl went missing, so close to home, the headlines came quickly. The child's name was Shannon Matthews. She was 9 years old, quiet, small for her age, and living with her family in Dewsbury. On the surface, she seemed like any other little girl, going to school, playing with friends, and dreaming about ordinary things. But her story was about to unfold in a way that shocked her community and eventually the entire country. Shannon had been born on September 9th, 1998. Her mother was Karen Matthews, and her father was a man named Leon Rose. Karen herself had grown up in Dewsbury. She left school at the age of 16 after falling out with her parents, and by 17, she had already given birth to her first child. What followed was a life defined by unstable relationships, frequent arguments, and a struggle to care for the many children she brought into the world. After her first child, Karen began a relationship with a young man named Leon Rose. Within a short time, she was pregnant again, this time with Shannon. Their relationship was never stable. There were disagreements, separations, and long stretches of distance. By the time Shannon was born, Karen and Leon were already strained. Shannon entered the world not into stability, but into uncertainty. Karen gave birth at a hospital in Dewsbury, but she didn't take Shannon straight home to Leon. Instead, she went to stay with her parents, June and Gordon. Despite past conflicts between Karen and her family, June and Gordon stepped in to help. They had raised 7 children of their own and knew what it meant to provide a safe, structured environment. For the first few months of Shannon's life, they tried to give her exactly that. But it didn't last. When Karen eventually returned to live with Leon, her struggles as a parent quickly became clear. She often refused to buy basic items like diapers, choosing instead to use plastic bags or towels as makeshift replacements. Reports would later reveal that money which should have gone toward her children was often spent on cigarettes, takeaway meals, and alcohol. Neighbors and relatives noticed. Concerns were raised. 2 to 3 years after Shannon's birth, in 2001, Karen and Leon finally split for good. Leon moved on, eventually starting a new family in Huddersfield, about 10 miles away. Karen, meanwhile, kept Shannon and some of her other children with her. By 2003, at only 28 years old, she had already given birth to 6 children with 5 different fathers. 3 of those children, including Shannon, lived with her. The other 3 lived with their fathers, as arranged by social services. That same year, Karen moved into a council property on the Moorside estate, a housing development in Dewsbury. At the time, the estate was considered one of the better options for families in need of social housing. The government had invested heavily in improving the area, trying to reduce crime and create a stronger sense of community. Benches and play equipment were installed. Patrols by police officers became more common. For many families, Moorside was a place of second chances. But behind the front door of Karen's home, life was far from ideal. Not long after moving there, she began a new relationship with a much younger man named Craig Meehan. Karen was 28. Craig was only 18. Their relationship quickly became serious, and before long, Karen was pregnant again. Craig's family lived nearby, and the couple settled into a routine on the estate. But while Craig and Karen appeared as a young couple trying to build a family, those closest to them soon noticed troubling signs. Teachers, neighbors, and even relatives began to report Karen to social services. Their concerns were consistent: neglect, poor hygiene, children left unsupervised, and the presence of alcohol abuse in the home. By 2002, Shannon and her siblings were placed on the council's at-risk register. This meant that authorities would monitor Karen's parenting closely. Social workers found that Karen's ability to care for her children was deeply compromised. She often put her own needs, alcohol, cigarettes, nights out, above theirs. Reports showed that sometimes both Karen and Craig would leave the children alone in the house for entire nights. At other times, they simply refused to provide proper meals. Concern after concern piled up. But even with those warning signs, in 2004, Shannon and her siblings were removed from the register. Social workers, relying on scheduled visits, often found the home looking acceptable when they arrived. What they didn't realize was that Karen always had notice of their visits. She used that time to make the house appear cleaner, sometimes borrowing money from her mother just to put food in the fridge for the inspection. June, Karen's mother, would later recall that this was the only time she ever saw her daughter stock proper food in the cupboards. To outsiders, the Matthews family presented a picture of dysfunction. To social services, it sometimes looked like things were improving, but for Shannon, it was a childhood filled with instability, neglect, and broken promises. And it would all come to a breaking point in February 2008. By 2007, Shannon lived full-time with her mother, Karen Matthews, and Karen's partner, Craig Meehan, on the Moorside estate in Dewsbury. Her world was small: school, a crowded house, and a bedroom she shared with her younger sister. Teachers worried about her. She struggled to focus on reading and writing. Sometimes, she arrived in unwashed clothes. Staff noticed makeshift fixes, like tape used to hold shoes together. Her head teacher called social services again. Shannon and her siblings had already been removed from the at-risk register years earlier. Scheduled visits meant Karen always had warning. Before those visits, she asked her mother, June, for money to buy food so the kitchen would look stocked. June later said those were the only times she saw proper food in the cupboards. Neighbors and relatives had long raised concerns about neglect. There were reports of nights when the children were left at home. People also believed Karen put her own wants first. By then, she had 7 children with different fathers. Benefits for each child were her main income. Even with the strain at home, Shannon tried to hold on to normal moments. She visited her father, Leon, in Huddersfield. She got along with him, with her brother, and with Leon's new wife. Those visits gave her a calmer space. After another dispute between Karen and Leon, the visits stopped. Karen refused to let Shannon go. At 9 years old, Shannon shared a bunk bed with her 2-year-old sister. The pink wallpaper in their room peeled at the edges. Behind the loose paper, Shannon scratched small messages on the wall, like a private diary. One message said she wanted to live with her dad. Tension rose inside the house. Karen and Craig argued. Sometimes, Shannon clashed with Craig too. On the night of February 18th, 2008, an argument broke out. Shannon swore at Craig and ran to her uncle's house down the road, Karen's brother. She liked being there with her cousins and felt safer. Her uncle did not want to be caught in the middle. He asked his 10-year-old daughter to walk Shannon back. Shannon cried the whole way home. The next morning, February 19th, 2008, the house was still heavy with the fight from the night before. It was the day of Shannon's first school swimming lesson. She had looked forward to it for weeks. She dressed in her Westmore Junior School uniform, put on her favorite rain boots with pink around the edges, picked up her swimming bag, and left the house at about 8 a.m. Karen had just woken up. Still angry from the argument, she shouted after her daughter, "Get out of the house and don't come back." Those words, thrown out in anger, were the last Shannon heard from her mother as she walked to school. That morning, Shannon walked to school with her bag over her shoulder. At Westmore Junior School, her friends noticed she was quieter than usual. Normally she was playful, sometimes even chatty, but that day she seemed withdrawn. Her best friend Megan thought it was strange. Shannon had been excited about the swimming lesson for weeks, yet on the bus ride to the sports center she barely spoke. Once they arrived, Shannon's mood lifted. She got into the pool with Megan, laughed, and enjoyed her very first swimming lesson. For that short time, she seemed like herself again. When the lesson ended, the children boarded the bus back to school. But on the ride home, Shannon grew quiet again. Megan noticed, but didn't ask questions. She didn't want to pry. At about 3:10 p.m., the bus reached the school. A teacher, Mrs. Tingle, stood outside to watch the children get off. Megan stepped down, but she did not see which way Shannon went. Mrs. Tingle also couldn't say. That was the last confirmed sighting of Shannon Matthews. By 4 p.m., Shannon had not returned home. Karen went to a neighbor's house to ask if they had seen her daughter. They hadn't. At first, Karen was not too worried. She thought Shannon might have gone to a friend's house or to visit family on the way back. She and her sister Amanda went out to check the shops. When they came back around 6:45 p.m., Shannon was still missing. At 6:48 p.m., Karen dialed 999 to report her 9-year-old daughter missing. By 7:15 p.m., police officers arrived at the Matthews house. They were greeted not by Karen, but by Craig and the other children. Karen had gone out again, saying she was searching for Shannon. When officers spoke to her later, she insisted that Shannon would never run away. She said her daughter was happy and believed she had been abducted. Police searched the house. Inside, they found rubbish on the floor, clothes and shoes scattered around, and piles of takeaway containers in the kitchen. The smell of cigarettes hung in the air. When officers asked questions, Karen became defensive. To her, it felt like they were wasting time in the house instead of searching outside. The police explained it was standard procedure. They needed to check for any clue about where Shannon might have gone. Soon, neighbors began to gather. Word spread quickly. People joined in the search, walking the streets, calling out Shannon's name. Meanwhile, police also drove to Huddersfield to inform Shannon's father, Leon. He was devastated. He immediately set off for Dewsbury to join the search. That night, search teams began line searches across the nearby fields and footpaths, tracing every possible route Shannon could have taken home from school. Friends, family, and complete strangers joined in. The search continued late into the freezing night. Temperatures dropped to -9 degrees Celsius. If Shannon had run away, many feared she would not survive the cold. But despite the desperate search, no trace of her was found. By dawn, worry had turned into something heavier. This was no ordinary missing child case. The morning of February 20th began with urgency. Shannon had been missing for a full night. By then, police were treating her disappearance with far greater concern. Over 200 officers were assigned to the case. They began knocking on doors, speaking with neighbors, and checking every place a child might hide or wander into. Teams searched shopping centers, playgrounds, and nearby houses. They looked inside garages and sheds, but every lead turned up nothing. The second day of searching ended much as the first had, with no sign of Shannon. That evening, the community grew restless. People remembered the case of Madeleine McCann, still fresh in everyone's mind. Many feared this was happening all over again. On the Moorside estate, a woman named Julie Bushby, head of the local tenants association, took it upon herself to organize a wider search. She rallied residents, encouraged them to join, and helped coordinate volunteers. Soon, members of the public were out in force, walking the streets, checking fields, and putting up posters. For many, it was personal. They didn't want to believe a little girl could disappear from their estate. Hundreds of people gave up work and daily routines to help. Meanwhile, police returned to Karen's house. They spoke with her and with Craig, asking more questions. Karen appeared distraught, but she stayed indoors most of the time with her younger children. The case was now gathering national attention. Chief Superintendent Barry South held a press conference. He assured the public that the police were doing everything they could. They didn't want to repeat the mistakes seen in Portugal with the McCann investigation. The pressure was heavy and the eyes of the country were now on Dewsbury. But despite the growing search, the posters, the interviews, and the police presence, no one could say where Shannon had gone. The first 48 hours had passed. The fear of abduction was no longer just an idea. It was beginning to look like the only explanation. By the second day, the search for Shannon was no longer just a local effort. It had become one of the largest investigations the West Yorkshire Police had handled in years. Volunteers kept pouring in. Residents of the Moorside estate and nearby areas gave their time without hesitation. Posters with Shannon's photo were printed in the hundreds. Families walked the streets carrying them. Some pinned them to lampposts and bus stops. Others wore them across their chests as they searched. The police stepped up their resources. A helicopter equipped with heat-seeking cameras flew over fields and wasteland. Mounted officers searched through rough ground and heavy scrub. Specially trained recovery dogs were brought in to sniff through possible hiding places. Divers broke ice on a frozen lake to search beneath the water. On February 21st, more than 200 residents joined officers to carry out detailed line searches. They walked together, side by side, through open land, gardens, and hidden corners of the estate. It was cold, exhausting work, but people kept going. The wider public wanted to help too. Newspapers offered rewards. One paper pledged £20,000 for information. A local business added another £5,000. Soon, the figure rose higher. The Sun newspaper increased the total to £50,000. The money gave people hope that someone might come forward with a lead. At the same time, police returned again to Karen's house. They questioned her and Craig about Shannon's habits, her friends, and her routines. They asked about her behavior in the days before she vanished. Karen appeared distressed, sometimes emotional, sometimes flat. She stayed home most of the time, rarely taking part in the physical searches. Against police advice, Karen also gave her first media appearance. Holding a teddy bear, she spoke to reporters. She called Shannon her princess and pleaded for her return. To outsiders, it looked like a desperate mother begging for her child. But those who knew Karen well found it strange. They said she had never called Shannon her princess before. Some thought the teddy bear was only for show, a way to look vulnerable. 2 weeks into the search, the police held another press conference. This time, Karen appeared with Craig by her side. Both wore shirts with Shannon's face printed on them. Karen again clutched a teddy bear. She said she believed her daughter had been taken by someone close, someone she thought she could trust. Her words unsettled many. Her demeanor was flat. She didn't cry like before. Friends noticed the change and whispered their doubts. But the police didn't stop. By now, the investigation had become massive. 250 officers were working the case, along with 60 detectives. They had knocked on more than 3,000 doors and spoken to over 1,500 motorists. They had searched 500 homes along Shannon's route to school. They had checked computer hard drives, watched hundreds of hours of CCTV footage, and even combed through the sex offender registry. The scale was extraordinary, and yet, still, no sign of Shannon. Each day that passed made the silence louder. As the days went on, the investigation widened. West Yorkshire Police set up a special website called the Help Find Shannon Matthews Fund. On it, they posted updates, shared new photographs, and appealed for any information. A more recent photo of Shannon was circulated to keep the case fresh in the public eye. Police also released the recording of Karen's 999 call from the night Shannon went missing. Hearing the mother's voice as she reported her child gone was meant to stir memories, or maybe jog someone into coming forward. But the longer Shannon stayed missing, the more people began to whisper. Rumours spread quickly across the estate. Some claimed that Craig Meehan, Karen's partner, had a temper. There were whispers that he could be violent toward Shannon. Both Karen and Craig denied it, insisting he had nothing to do with her disappearance. Despite those denials, suspicion lingered. It didn't help that Karen's house was constantly crowded with reporters and police, while 3 of her children still lived there. The constant noise and cameras made the atmosphere tense. Behind the scenes, police pushed the investigation further. They worked on a full set of Shannon's fingerprints and created a full DNA profile. They explained to Karen and Craig that this meant one of the children in their home was not Craig's biological child. Police also began mapping Karen's extended family. The Matthews family tree was long and complex, with more than 350 names. Investigators wanted to visit each person to rule them in or out. It would be slow work, but thoroughness was essential. Amid all this, one name stood out. It was not originally on the family tree list. Michael Donovan, Craig's uncle. He lived only half a mile away. Despite his closeness, he had not been mentioned at first, not even by Karen. Police decided they needed to speak to him. Donovan had a reputation for being a loner. He lived on benefits after a head injury from a car accident. He rarely worked and mostly kept to himself. What troubled police most was that, while hundreds of people searched day and night, Donovan had never once joined in. Detectives decided to pay him a visit. They walked into the block of flats where he lived, a place called Lydgate Gardens. It was a large estate of flats with long corridors and shared staircases. When they knocked at his door, there was no answer. Neighbors told them Donovan should be home. One neighbor who lived directly below reported something unusual. That morning, she had heard footsteps upstairs, not just an adult's, but lighter, quicker steps. She thought it sounded like a child. At the time, she dismissed it. She believed Donovan might have a new girlfriend with a child. But the detectives were not convinced. They called for backup. A larger team gathered in the stairwell to plan their next step. They debated. Should they break in? What if they were wrong? But what if they weren't? Inside that flat could be the answer the entire country was waiting for. The officers stood quietly in the stairwell of Lydgate Gardens. The block was silent, every sound echoing. They decided they could not wait any longer. If Shannon was inside, every second mattered. They moved down the hallway toward Donovan's flat. The atmosphere was tense. The flat was still. When they entered, the air smelled strongly of cigarette smoke. The rooms looked undisturbed, almost too ordinary. They began to search, opening doors one by one. Then they reached a room where the bed seemed out of place. Something was wrong. The sheets were warm, as if someone had just been lying there. Suddenly they heard it, a faint sound, muffled and small. It was a child's voice. The words were hard to make out, but it was a cry. "Stop it, you're frightening me." The officers froze. They pulled at the bed. It was heavy. Beneath it, there were drawers built into the frame. At first, the drawers seemed stuck. Then, something moved inside. They pulled again, harder this time, and from the shadows, a small figure appeared. It was Shannon. She was weak, dazed, and too disoriented to stand on her own. One of the detectives, Paul Kettlewell, lifted her gently from the drawer. He asked where Donovan was. Shannon whispered, "He's under the bed." The officers looked closer. Peering into the space, they saw him. Michael Donovan, curled tightly in the fetal position, hiding. They shouted for him to come out. He didn't move. Even as they pulled at him, he resisted. In the end, they dragged him out by force. Neighbors had begun to gather in the corridor, alerted by the noise. When they saw Shannon in the arms of the police, one woman called out, "Is that her? Is that Shannon?" An officer nodded. The hallway erupted with shouts, some of relief, some of anger. People hurled insults at Donovan as he was pulled away in handcuffs. Outside, Donovan was shoved into the back of a police car. Shannon was placed in a separate vehicle, rushed away from the flats to safety. The search team stayed behind to examine the flat. What they found inside was chilling. In one corner, a long white strap hung from the ceiling. Donovan had used it to tie Shannon, restricting her movements. It was just long enough for her to reach the bed and the bathroom, nowhere else. They found packets of travel sickness tablets and a supply of diazepam, drugs used to sedate. They found £600 in cash, as if Donovan had been preparing to run. There were duffel bags of clothes packed and ready. A newspaper lay nearby, one that reported on the reward money for Shannon's safe return. On a table was a piece of paper. Written on it were rules Shannon had been forced to follow. "You must not make any noise. You must not go near the windows. You must not do anything unless I am here. Keep the TV volume low. You may play Super Mario games or watch certain videos." At the bottom of the list, Donovan had written the letters, "IPU, I promise you." Among the clutter, police also discovered a children's colouring book called Arrive Alive about travel safety. Seeing it there only made the room feel more unsettling. The evidence painted a clear picture. Donovan had not stumbled into this. He had prepared, and he had kept Shannon hidden for 24 days. For the officers who carried Shannon out of that flat, the relief was overwhelming. They had feared the worst. Instead, they had found her alive. But the question remained, why had she been taken, and why by him? When word spread that Shannon had been found alive, emotions erupted across Dewsbury. At the police station, hardened detectives who had worked on the case for weeks broke into tears. Many of them were parents themselves. One detective later said the room felt like winning the lottery. People hugged, some cried, others simply stood in shock. News travelled fast to the Moorside estate. At the community centre, where neighbours had been gathering daily, Julie Bushby was the first to hear. She shouted out the news, and within minutes people were running into the streets, screaming, cheering, and hugging one another. Some danced, others cried openly. Cars honked their horns as word spread. Shannon was alive. The estate quickly turned into a celebration. Shops donated bottles of champagne. Music played loudly through open windows. Children laughed and ran about. Adults hugged strangers in relief. For a moment, it felt like the entire community had been given back a piece of hope. At the same time, police officers drove to Karen Matthews' house to tell her the news. Reporters were already waiting outside, cameras ready to capture the moment. Karen's reaction stood out immediately. When officers told her Shannon had been found, she did not smile or show joy. At first, she stared blankly, as if stunned. Then she burst into tears and turned her face away from the cameras. Some who stood there thought it was odd. For 24 days she had cried in front of reporters, holding teddy bears and begging for her princess. But now, when her daughter was safe, she seemed strangely detached. Julie Bushby shouted at her, "Smile, woman! For God's sake, smile!" Others joined in, urging her to show happiness. Only then did Karen turn back to the cameras and force a small smile. Police offered to drive Karen to the station to see Shannon, but because the investigation was still ongoing, she would only be allowed to see her daughter through a window to protect forensic evidence. On the way, Karen asked no questions about her daughter's condition. When she saw Shannon through the glass, she didn't cry or press her hand against the window. Instead, she simply said, "Oh, she's got her clothes on." The difference between the community's joy and Karen's flat response could not have been clearer. Meanwhile, social services moved quickly. They decided Shannon would not return home. She was placed under police protection for 72 hours, using Section 46 of the Children's Act of 1989. Karen was told she would not get her daughter back until the investigation was complete. That night, police arranged for Karen and Craig to stay in a hotel. With the estate crowded by reporters, they said it was to give them a break from the attention, but suspicions were already forming. Back at Moorside, the celebrations continued into the early hours. Neighbours lit candles along the street. Children at Shannon's school held an assembly, many breaking into tears of relief when they were told she had been found. Some of her classmates wrote letters for her, more than 20 in total, ready for when she returned. But Shannon never did return. Michael Donovan was taken to Halifax police station after his arrest. At first, he refused to say anything. He sat in silence, ignoring questions. But later, with his lawyer present, he began to talk. His story shocked investigators. Donovan claimed he had not acted alone. He said Karen Matthews had come to him with a plan. According to him, she wanted to stage a kidnapping of her own daughter. Shannon would stay with him, hidden, while the public believed she had been abducted. Once the reward money reached a high enough figure, Karen would contact him. Together, they would arrange to find Shannon and claim the money. Donovan said Karen promised to split the reward with him. He even claimed she threatened him when he hesitated. She told him she knew men who would hurt him if he didn't do as she asked, including one man who had already killed before. Out of fear, he said, he agreed. Inside Donovan's flat, police had already discovered evidence that backed up parts of his story. They found the rules Shannon had been forced to follow, written in Donovan's hand. They found the sedatives he had given her. Toxicology tests later showed Shannon had been given these types of drugs for almost 20 months, which explained why teachers had noticed her lack of focus in school. There was also the packed luggage, the £600 in cash, and the copy of the newspaper announcing the £50,000 reward. All of it suggested Donovan had been preparing to flee. When Shannon was questioned gently by specialists, she explained little. At first she seemed confused, quiet and fearful. She spent only 10 minutes a day with interviewers, in a room designed to look like a classroom. But she told them Donovan had taken her after school and that he had promised to take her to a fair. Instead, she ended up locked in his flat. Meanwhile, Karen's behavior was coming under closer scrutiny. Neighbors who had once defended her now whispered that something felt wrong. They remembered how, while Shannon was missing, Karen often sat around laughing or eating takeaway food, only to burst into tears when the cameras arrived. They began to question her press conferences, her sudden changes of emotion, and her flat reaction when Shannon was found. Police also discovered more troubling news. As part of the wider investigation, they had searched Craig Meehan's computer. On April 2nd, he was arrested after indecent images of children were found on his hard drive. He was later charged with 11 counts of possession. His sister Amanda, along with Donovan's mother Alice, were also arrested on suspicion of helping to cover up the staged kidnapping, though both were eventually released on bail. By now, the community that had celebrated Shannon's return was beginning to feel betrayed. Why wasn't Karen showing the joy everyone expected? Why wasn't she desperate to see her daughter? And why was Donovan pointing the finger directly at her? The truth was beginning to surface, and when it did, it would shock even those who thought they already knew the worst. By early April, suspicion was heavy on Karen Matthews. The police had Donovan's statement. They had Craig under arrest on separate charges. And neighbors, who had once defended her, no longer trusted her tears. It was Julie Bushby and Natalie, two women who had stood beside Karen through the whole search, who decided something had to be done. They knew the police were already suspicious, but they wanted to hear it from Karen herself. With the help of Family Liaison Officer Christine Freeman, they arranged a meeting. Christine picked Karen up and sat her in the passenger seat of her car. Then they drove to collect Julie and Natalie. At first, they spoke carefully. They told Karen about the rumors spreading across the estate, that she had something to do with Shannon's disappearance. Karen sat quietly. Julie then asked directly, "Were you involved in Shannon's abduction?" Karen broke down. She began to cry, more hysterically than she had ever shown in front of cameras. Through sobs, she said the words, "It's true." For the first time, she admitted what many had already begun to suspect. On April 6th, 2008, 47 days after Shannon went missing, Karen Matthews was arrested. She was charged with attempting to pervert the course of justice and with child neglect. At the same time, police revealed another disturbing detail. Members of Karen's family had contacted the McCann family, Kate and Jerry McCann, whose daughter Madeline had vanished the year before, asking for money to support the search for Shannon. The McCanns were horrified. They had already donated £25,000 to the appeal, but police now advised them to stop. Investigators began piecing together Karen's real role in the plan. They believed she had arranged the staged kidnapping with Michael Donovan in a small local cafe. Shannon, they said, was tricked into getting a lift with Donovan after school. Karen had promised Donovan that once the reward money reached £50,000, she would tell him what to do next. Donovan had memorized the plan after Karen gave it to him on paper. She told him to flush the note down the toilet so no one could ever find it. He agreed, afraid of the threats she made. The staged abduction had been clumsy and cruel. What Karen had never expected was that it would drag on for 24 long days, that her own daughter would be drugged and hidden under a bed, and that the entire community, her friends and neighbors, would pour out their hearts, searching for a child she knew was never lost. When the truth began to spread, the Moorside estate was filled with anger. People who had spent hours searching, who had donated money, who had believed in her tears, now felt betrayed. For Karen, the celebration that once surrounded her had turned into fury. After Karen Matthews admitted the truth and was arrested, the case against her moved quickly. On March 17th, just 3 days after Shannon was found, Michael Donovan had already been officially charged and remanded in custody. He appeared at Leeds Crown Court by video link. Karen followed soon after her arrest in April, charged with child neglect and attempting to pervert the course of justice. Investigators worked to connect the pieces. From Donovan, they had the story of how the plan began. From Shannon, they learned she had been tricked into his car after school, told she was being taken to a fair. Instead, she was locked in his flat for 24 days, tied up with a strap so she could reach only the bed and the bathroom. Forensic tests showed Shannon had been given sedatives, travel sickness medication and diazepam to keep her subdued. Toxicology suggested she had been given similar drugs for up to 20 months before her disappearance, which explained her struggles to concentrate in school. When police revealed this, the picture of neglect and abuse became even clearer. Teachers had noticed her poor focus, her tiredness, but they had never known the real reason. Meanwhile, Shannon was placed under the protection of social services. She was not returned to her mother. Instead, she was given a new identity and moved away from Dewsbury. Her grandparents, June and Gordon, longed to see her again, but were denied contact. They later said they hoped, when Shannon grew older, she might reach out to them herself. By November 2008, both Karen Matthews and Michael Donovan stood trial together at Leeds Crown Court. The courtroom heard every detail. Donovan's flat had been searched, the evidence laid out. The strap, the sedatives, the bags packed to flee, the cash, the note with rules for Shannon, and the newspaper reporting the reward money. The jury listened to Shannon's account through careful interviews. They heard how she had been told to stay silent, to follow Donovan's rules, and how she had been too frightened to resist. Karen, sitting in the dock, cried at times, but her explanations changed often. She told 5 different versions of events, denying, twisting, and shifting blame. The jury did not believe her. After 6 hours of deliberation, the verdict came back. Both Karen Matthews and Michael Donovan were found guilty of kidnapping, false imprisonment, and perverting the course of justice. The judge sentenced them each to 8 years in prison. Donovan, beaten in prison after the details of the case became known, appeared in court with a broken jaw. But neither he nor Karen showed lasting remorse. For the community of Moorside, the anger was deep. They had searched day and night, raised money, planted flowers, and lit candles for a girl whose disappearance had been staged. They felt cheated, used, and humiliated. For Shannon, the outcome meant something different. Taken from the chaos of her mother's home, she was given the chance at a new life, one hidden from the glare of cameras, away from the betrayal of the plan that had used her as a pawn. But the scars of those 24 days and of the life before them would remain. The case of Shannon Matthews ended not with the safe return everyone had prayed for, but with the shocking truth that the danger had been inside her own home all along. When the verdict was announced and both Karen Matthews and Michael Donovan were sentenced to 8 years in prison, the story did not end. For the Moorside estate, the sense of betrayal ran deep. Neighbours who had spent weeks searching, donating money, and standing by Karen now felt tricked. Many said they would never forgive her. Shannon was not returned to her family. Instead, she was placed under the protection of social services. She was given a completely new identity, a new name, a new home, and a new start. None of her friends from Dewsbury saw her again. Her grandparents, June and Gordon, and her father, Leon Rose, longed for contact, but were denied. They received only occasional updates from social workers. They hoped one day, when she was old enough, she might reach out. Karen served half of her sentence and was released in 2012. She was given a new identity as well. Michael Donovan was also released after serving part of his term. Both returned quietly to life outside prison, though their names remained forever tied to the case. The case left scars on the community. The Moorside estate, once united in searching for Shannon, had been left divided and bitter. For many, the memory of planting flowers, releasing balloons, and lighting candles for a girl who was never truly lost was painful. They felt used by someone they had trusted. For Shannon, the staged abduction became the turning point of her life. Taken from an unsafe home, she was placed into care where she would no longer be under her mother's neglect. Some later said, with grim irony, that Karen's crime, as cruel as it was, had at least given Shannon the chance of a better future. Years later, the case is still remembered, not only because of the shocking betrayal by a mother, but because of the enormous search that cost millions and mobilized thousands, all built on a lie. The story of Shannon Matthews remains one of Britain's most infamous child abduction cases, not because she was lost, but because of who had planned for her to be taken. Before we move on to the next case, take a moment and make sure you're subscribed. If you've been listening this far and you haven't yet, now is the time to click that button. Stories like these deserve to be told, and I don't want you to miss the next one. Story 2, November 13th, 1974, Amityville, Long Island, New York. At 112 Ocean Avenue stood a large Dutch colonial home, its white frame facing the river, its windows shaped like watchful eyes. It looked peaceful from the outside, resting in a quiet village not far from New York City. Yet inside that house, something unthinkable had taken place. When police entered, they found silence. A family of 7 had lived here, but only one remained alive. One by one, in their beds, the DeFeo family had been gunned down during the early morning hours. Ronald DeFeo Sr., his wife Louise, and 4 of their children lay dead. Their eldest son, Ronald DeFeo Jr., known as Butch, was the only survivor. Neighbors would later recall how the house had always drawn attention. It sat close to the road, on Ocean Avenue, where cars passed constantly. The house was not hidden away, not isolated in the woods. It stood in full view, and yet, during those dark hours, no one seemed to hear the rifle blasts that echoed inside. The family that once lived there had moved from Brooklyn nearly a decade earlier. In 1965, Ronald DeFeo Sr., known in his neighborhood as Big Ronnie, brought his wife Louise and their children to Amityville in search of a better life. The house was not theirs alone to buy. Louise's father had placed the down payment. He wanted his daughter to live in comfort, with space for her children to grow. The home was large, with 5 bedrooms, 3.5 bathrooms, and even a boathouse at the edge of the property. It was, in many ways, the dream of families leaving the crowded boroughs of New York, the promise of suburban safety, good schools, and wide yards. The DeFeos named the house High Hopes. Yet, within its walls, daily life was far from peaceful. Big Ronnie was loud, demanding, and often violent. Neighbors noticed his temper, and family members remembered his heavy hand. Louise, once a model, tried to keep the household together, but she too lived under his shadow. Their eldest child, Ronald Jr., Butch, bore the weight most of all. From an early age, Butch was beaten harshly. Witnesses later recalled seeing Big Ronnie shove him into a wall when he was only 2 years old, leaving the boy with a skull injury. Relatives remembered him being slapped and humiliated in front of others. His siblings, Dawn, Allison, Mark, and John, were also punished. But Butch and Dawn often stepped forward to shield the younger children, taking the blows themselves. By the time they moved into the Amityville home, the pattern of abuse had already taken root. On the outside, the family looked successful: a big house, well-dressed children, and a father who worked at his father-in-law's car dealership in Brooklyn. Inside, fear and anger grew day by day. The neighbors of Amityville could not see all that happened, but they sensed the family was different. Big Ronnie's outbursts were hard to ignore, and Butch, as he grew, became known not as a quiet child, but as a troubled one. At school, classmates mocked his weight, and he lashed back with aggression. Teachers and friends noticed the bruises, the short temper, the restless energy of a boy caught between fear of his father and his own building rage. This was the world inside 112 Ocean Avenue, a house called High Hopes, but filled with violence, secrets, and silence. And in November of 1974, it would become the scene of one of the most infamous crimes in American history. Ronald DeFeo Sr., known to everyone as Big Ronnie, had been born in Brooklyn on November 16, 1930. He grew up in a working-class neighborhood, strong-willed and determined to make a name for himself. He was tall, imposing, and carried himself like a man who wanted control over everything around him. His wife, Louise Brigante, was born just 1 year later on November 3rd, 1931. She was beautiful, elegant, and once worked as a model before settling into family life. When she met Ronnie, she fell for his confidence, even though her parents did not approve. Her family, the Brigantes, did not like Ronnie from the start. They thought he was too rough, too proud, and too quick-tempered. They begged Louise not to marry him. But she followed her heart, and when they wed, her parents cut ties, disappointed in her choice. That silence from her family lasted until the couple's first child arrived. On September 26, 1951, Ronald Joseph DeFeo Jr. was born. The boy was given his father's name, but was soon called Butch. When her parents saw their grandson, their anger began to fade. They could not stay away from Louise forever. The Brigantes slowly returned, drawn by the child, but the tension never fully disappeared. For the first 5 years of his life, Butch was an only child. Louise cared for him deeply, but she could not protect him from his father's temper. Ronnie Sr. had a violent streak, and he believed in strict punishment. Even at that time, family members and neighbors noticed his aggression. It was not unusual for him to slap or strike Butch, even in front of others. One incident stood out. When Butch was only 2 years old, relatives witnessed Big Ronnie shove him into a wall. The little boy's head hit so hard that he suffered a minor skull fracture. It shocked those who saw it. Even in the 1950s, when physical discipline was common, this level of violence was extreme. And it did not stop there. Ronnie Sr. was not only aggressive with his children, he was also harsh with his wife. He shouted at her, insulted her, and struck her even during her pregnancies. Her parents, the Brigantes, despised him for this. They had warned her, and now they watched helplessly as their daughter endured what they had feared. Butch's childhood was not peaceful. He was slapped, spanked, and humiliated, sometimes in front of guests. As he grew older, the abuse became worse. He was not the only child. His siblings soon came along. Dawn was born in 1956, Allison in 1961, Mark in 1962, and the youngest, John, in 1965. Butch, as the oldest, often tried to shield them. He and Dawn especially would step in when their father lashed out at the younger ones, taking the blows themselves. This constant violence left scars that went beyond bruises. Butch was fragile, both physically and emotionally. Witnesses later said that he carried the anger with him and that he sometimes turned it outward. Children who suffer abuse often cannot fight back at the parent who harms them. Instead, they direct their frustration at others. And this is what began to happen with Butch. At school, he became the bully. He lashed out at classmates, especially as he grew heavier and was mocked for his weight. Butch did not forget the insults, and he often fought back with aggression. Teachers noticed the change in him, but in those years, schools rarely intervened in family matters. Even when the children came to class with bruises, nothing was done. The abuse shaped the home. Big Ronnie ruled with fear. Louise tried to keep peace, but she could not control her husband. To outsiders, the DeFeos appeared to live a good life. They dressed well, they seemed prosperous, and in 1965 they moved into a grand home in Amityville. But beneath that polished surface, the family was breaking apart. The house on Ocean Avenue was meant to be a dream. It was a gift from Louise's father, Michael Brigante, who wanted to help his daughter escape the turmoil. He put down 30% of the cost, giving them a start. Ronnie Sr. worked at Michael's car dealership in Brooklyn, earning a salary that helped cover the mortgage and expenses. On the surface, it seemed like success, but inside the walls of that house, the cycle of abuse continued. Neighbors in Amityville soon noticed the family was different. They were not as friendly, not as calm as others in the village. Big Ronnie's voice could be heard, loud and angry. His children carried the weight of his temper. And for Butch, the eldest son, the pressure grew heavier with each passing year. He was expected to be strong, to protect his siblings, but he was also the one who received the hardest punishments. He began to carry both fear and fury, a dangerous mix that would shape his future. The DeFeos had reached Long Island, chasing the dream of peace and prosperity. But behind the closed doors of 112 Ocean Avenue, that dream was unraveling. The DeFeo family settled into their new life in Amityville, but the move to Long Island did not change what happened behind closed doors. By the time they entered the home at 112 Ocean Avenue, Butch was 14 years old, Dawn was 11, Allison was 3, Mark was barely a toddler, and the youngest, John, would be born soon after. On the outside, the family looked like they had made it. Big house, a father working in a dealership, children in good schools. Inside, the cycle of violence only deepened. Big Ronnie was still feared by everyone in the household. His punishments were harsh, and his voice carried through the walls. He wanted control, and he hated the thought of losing it. He struck his children, shamed them, and humiliated his wife. Neighbors noticed how loud he was and how unfriendly the family seemed compared to others in the village. Butch, as the oldest, could not escape his father's hand. He had been fragile since his head injury as a toddler, but now he was carrying a different burden. He was no longer just a victim. He was becoming angry himself. When he went to school, he was mocked for being overweight. His classmates teased him relentlessly. His father joined in, calling him names, belittling him, and fueling the rage that grew inside. The bullying and abuse made Butch dangerous. Children who suffer violence at home often release their anger where they can, and Butch began lashing out at others. At school, he turned into the bully. He picked on classmates, started fights, and showed signs of the same aggression he had endured from his father. Teachers noticed the bruises, friends saw the temper, but in those years, no one intervened. The 1960s and early 1970s were not a time when schools stepped into family matters. The abuse was visible, but it was ignored. Life inside the house grew even more complicated as the years went on. Big Ronnie abused not only his children, but also Louise, even while she was pregnant. The Brigantes, Louise's parents, remained angry about the marriage. They had tried to warn her, and now they watched their daughter suffer. But in their Italian Catholic family, divorce was not an option. Instead, they tried to help in other ways. In 1963, when things seemed broken between Ronnie and Louise, she briefly left him. He wanted her back. To win her, he wrote a song for a jazz singer in Chicago, a track called The Real Thing. It was his way of showing devotion after years of cruelty. Louise returned, but the cycle never ended. Ronnie would abuse, then shower his family with gifts or money, believing that would repair the damage. Her father, Michael Brigante, finally stepped in. He wanted to protect his daughter and her children, even if he couldn't break the marriage. He put down the money for the Amityville home, hoping a bigger house and a better environment would give them peace. But this gesture also created a new problem. Now, Ronnie Sr.'s job and finances were tied to his father-in-law. For a man obsessed with control, it was humiliating. Still, the family moved into the large white house on Ocean Avenue. They named it High Hopes. It had 5 bedrooms, 3.5 bathrooms, a big yard, and even a boathouse at the river's edge. It was everything a suburban dream should be. But the dream did not erase the reality. The children were growing. Butch, now in his teenage years, had become restless. His father's abuse pushed him further toward rebellion. At school, his reputation spread. He was a bully, he was violent, and he was hard to control. By the time he entered high school, drugs and alcohol had become his escape. The boy who once took beatings for his siblings was now carrying the rage outward. His father's violence had shaped him, and the home that looked perfect from the outside was now cracking under the weight of fear, anger, and silence. And soon, that silence would be shattered in ways no one in Amityville could ever forget. As Butch grew older, the troubles inside the DeFeo home only worsened. By the time he was a teenager, the abuse from his father was constant, and the tension in the family was heavy. Big Ronnie continued to rule the house with violence. He beat his children without hesitation, and he often directed his anger toward Louise as well. The younger children, Mark, Allison, and John, suffered too, but it was Butch and Dawn who usually took the brunt of it. They stepped in whenever their father lashed out at the younger ones. They stood between their siblings and the blows, protecting them as best as they could. It left them with both physical and emotional scars. Butch had always been a fragile child, but the years of abuse hardened him. What he could not fight at home, he turned outward. At school, he became a bully, carrying the violence with him. He was mocked for being overweight, called names, and humiliated, not only by classmates, but by his own father. His way of coping was to fight back, to dominate others so he would not feel small. The school did little to stop it. In those years, bullying was not treated the same way it is today. Teachers might have noticed, but they did not interfere. The bruises and marks that Butch and his siblings carried were also overlooked. It was common then for outsiders to turn away, even when abuse was obvious. As the children grew, the atmosphere inside 112 Ocean Avenue became darker. Butch started using drugs, and with them, his behavior became more unpredictable. He experimented with marijuana, LSD, and later heroin. The drugs took away his weight, making him slimmer, but they also made him more unstable. His obsession with guns grew stronger too. By his late teens, he was collecting firearms, spending money recklessly, and showing off his weapons to friends. Locals in Amityville knew him as unpredictable. At bars, he could be amusing at first, but when he drank too much, he turned into a loose cannon. Some said you never knew when he would snap. One resident even told reporters that when Butch was drunk, everyone worried about what he might do next. Life at home did not get better. Ronnie Sr. kept beating his wife and children. He shamed his daughters in front of their friends and hit his sons until they bled. The abuse was no secret in town, yet no one stopped it. One night at dinner, the whole family sat at the table when Butch dropped his napkin. He bent down to pick it up, but when he sat back up, his father exploded. "Why did you leave the table?" Ronnie Sr. shouted. Before Butch could answer, his father stormed from his chair, shoved him to the floor, and punched him again and again until his nose and mouth were bleeding. Then, as if nothing had happened, Big Ronnie sat back down, ordered everyone to continue eating, and expected silence. The family obeyed. Butch held his napkin against his face, trying to stop the blood, while everyone else ate in quiet fear. These moments built layer upon layer of resentment. Butch had already suffered a head injury as a child. Now, with years of abuse, bullying, and humiliation added to his fragile state, his anger grew beyond control. Friends who knew him in these years remembered that he fought constantly, with family, with classmates, with anyone who crossed him. The more he sank into drugs, the less control he had. LSD and heroin took over his days. He stopped showing up at the family dealership where he was supposed to work. He lived at home, high around his younger siblings, while his parents kept giving him money. Despite everything, Ronnie Sr. still showered Butch with gifts. He bought him cars, gave him a boat, and handed him $500 a week in allowance, an enormous amount in the early 1970s. Outsiders thought it strange. How could a family that appeared so violent also be so generous with the son who caused so much trouble? But this was part of the cycle. Ronnie Sr. lashed out in anger, then tried to make up for it with money and possessions. The contradictions piled up inside the house: fear and wealth, violence and silence, anger and indulgence. And through it all, Butch slipped further into darkness. The dream of a suburban home on Long Island had turned into something else entirely. And as the tension inside the DeFeo family reached new heights, the path ahead was leading towards something far more terrible. The tension inside the DeFeo home continued to rise as the children grew older. Ronnie Sr. showed no signs of changing his behavior. His temper was quick, his punishments harsh, and he demanded silence after every violent outburst. Louise stayed, unable to escape the cycle, and the children carried the fear every day. Butch, now in his late teens and early 20s, had become more unpredictable. His drug use was heavy. Marijuana, LSD, and heroin consumed him. At the same time, his obsession with guns grew stronger. He collected them, polished them, and showed them off. Friends said he never seemed far from a weapon. Despite his reckless behavior, his parents still allowed him to live at home. They gave him cars, a boat, and money each week. Butch did little work at the family dealership. He was supposed to help his father and grandfather at the business, but most of the time he skipped shifts. He floated through life with drugs, alcohol, and rage. The younger children, Mark, Allison, and John, still suffered under Big Ronnie's temper. Butch and Dawn often tried to protect them, but it was dangerous to intervene. Still, they stood up to their father when they could. Both of them carried the marks of his anger, but both refused to remain silent. The anger inside the house reached a breaking point more than once. One evening, Dawn invited a boy from her class to come over and study. They sat in the kitchen doing homework when her father returned home. Ronnie Sr. walked in, saw the boy, and immediately lost control. He called Dawn a whore and slapped her across the face again and again. Dawn snapped. She grabbed a knife from the counter and lunged at her father, ready to end years of fear in a single moment. Butch rushed into the kitchen and held her back, stopping her from stabbing their father. Dawn screamed and struggled, but Butch wrestled the knife from her hands before she could strike. It was not the only time violence came close to turning fatal. Only weeks later, Butch himself nearly killed his father. Ronnie Sr. was beating Louise when Butch stormed into the room, furious. He shouted at his father, called him a fat pig, and pointed one of his rifles at him. He pulled the trigger. The gun clicked, but no bullet fired. There was either no ammunition inside, or the gun misfired. Whatever the reason, the shot did not go off. If it had, Big Ronnie would have been dead. Butch told different versions of this story over the years. Sometimes, he said it happened in the bedroom, sometimes in another room. The details shifted, but the core remained the same. He had pointed a gun at his father and pulled the trigger. Friends later confirmed that Butch and Dawn had told them about these incidents at the time. It was not something invented years later. These moments revealed how far the family had fallen. Dawn had nearly stabbed her father. Butch had nearly shot him. Both children had been pushed to the edge by years of beatings, insults, and fear. And yet, the family continued to live together under the same roof at 112 Ocean Avenue. By 1974, Butch's life outside the home was no better. He was arrested in September for stealing an outboard motor from a boatyard in Babylon. He was placed on probation, but he did not stop getting into trouble. In November, he came up with a plan to steal money from his grandfather's dealership. The scheme was simple. He would deposit $19,000 in cash, and a friend would stage a robbery, stealing the money so that they could split it. The plan failed. Police questioned Butch after the robbery, and under pressure, he admitted what he had done. His grandfather chose not to press charges. He knew his grandson was deep in drugs and did not want to ruin him with prison. But this incident revealed Butch's growing desperation. He needed money for drugs, and he was willing to risk everything to get it. The failed robbery happened only days before the murders. The family home had become unbearable. The violence, the addiction, the constant tension, it was a storm waiting to break. Butch had already come close to killing his father once. Dawn had already raised a knife. The cycle of abuse had reached its peak. No one inside the house could know that within weeks everything would end in blood. In the days before November the 13th, 1974, the atmosphere inside the D.A. Feo home was tense and unsettled. The failed robbery at the dealership had left a mark. Butch had been questioned by police about the missing $19,000. He gave in quickly under pressure, admitting to the plan, but his grandfather had refused to press charges. It saved him from prison, but the shame lingered. Only a week separated that interrogation from what was about to happen. On the night of November 12th, Butch did not sleep. He stayed up late, restless, pacing around the house, flipping through channels on the television. By the early morning hours, the family had gone to bed. The house was quiet. At some point after 3 o'clock in the morning, the silence was broken. One by one, members of the DeFeo family were shot as they lay in their beds. Ronnie Sr. and Louise were in the master bedroom. Both were lying face down. He was struck twice in the back. She was also shot twice, her body tucked beneath the sheets. In the room beside them, Mark and John slept. Mark was 12 years old, John only 9. They too were found face down in their beds, each with a single gunshot wound to the back. Upstairs, Allison and Dawn lay in separate rooms. Allison, just 13, was shot once in the head. Dawn, 18, was also found face down, killed by a bullet to her head. Every one of them was killed as they slept. Every one of them was found in the same position. What makes the scene so haunting is not only the killings, but the silence that surrounded them. No neighbors reported hearing gunshots. No one in the house appeared to have woken up, run, or fought back. All were found still in their beds, as if frozen in place. At 6:30 that morning, Butch appeared at the family dealership in Brooklyn. To everyone there, it seemed like nothing was wrong. He parked his car and even pretended to have slept in it, claiming he had locked himself out of the house. When the manager arrived, he woke Butch, who then went about the day. Butch stayed at the dealership only briefly before leaving. He drove to a friend's house, spent some time there, and later went to the mall in Massapequa. He walked around with another friend, bought food, and even managed to buy a bag of heroin, which they used in his car. By the afternoon, Butch was back in Amityville. He ended up at a local bar called Henry's, only a short distance from his house. Henry's was a place he visited often. That day, he drank, spoke to regulars, and used the phone several times. He told his friend Bobby that he had been trying to call home all day, but no one answered. It was strange, he said, that nobody had picked up. Not long after, Butch left the bar. He said he wanted to check on his family. When he returned, he burst through the doors of Henry's once again, this time frantic and crying. He grabbed Bobby and shouted, "You have to help me! Someone shot my mother and father!" Bobby and a few other men rushed with him to the house at 112 Ocean Avenue. The gravel driveway crunched beneath their tires as they pulled up. Butch refused to go back inside. He stayed outside while the others entered. The men climbed the stairs and went to the master bedroom. There, they found Ronnie Sr. and Louise both lying dead on their stomachs. Shocked, they rushed back downstairs, one of them grabbing the phone in the kitchen to call the police. Another man continued upstairs to check the children's rooms. He found Mark and John lying dead in their beds. He returned in horror, telling the others that there were more victims. When the police officer from the Amityville Village Department arrived, the men explained what they had seen. 4 bodies upstairs, all face down, all shot. The officer asked Butch if anyone else was in the house. Only then did Butch mention his sisters, Dawn and Allison. The officer searched further and found the final 2 victims. Dawn and Allison lay in their beds on the 3rd floor. Both had been shot in the head. The entire DFO family, except Butch, was gone. As the first officer from the Amityville Village Police stood inside the house, the scene around him was overwhelming. He had confirmed that 6 bodies were lying in their beds, all shot, all face down. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. Knowing this was far beyond what their small department could handle, he immediately radioed for backup. Soon, more units arrived, followed by detectives from the Town of Babylon Police Department. But even they realized the scale of the crime was too much. Within minutes, Suffolk County detectives were also called in. By 7:45 p.m., the home on Ocean Avenue had been transformed into a command post. Officers filled the kitchen, while others went room to room. They began documenting the positions of the bodies, the layout of the rooms, and the conditions in which each family member was found. They noted how every victim had been lying on their stomachs, as if asleep. Neighbors gathered outside, watching as more and more police cars pulled up. Lights flashed against the dark street. The house, once just another large suburban home, had suddenly become the center of attention for the entire village. Inside, the investigators carefully examined the rooms. Ronald Sr. had been struck twice in the back. Louise, beside him, was also shot twice, but she remained tucked beneath the sheets. Mark and John, the 2 youngest boys, each had a single gunshot wound to the back. Allison and Dawn, upstairs, had both been shot in the head. Detectives were struck by how orderly the crime scene looked. None of the victims appeared to have moved from their beds. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no defensive wounds. It seemed as though they had all been killed in their sleep. But something felt strange. The rifle that had been used in the murders was powerful and loud. A .35 caliber Marlin rifle could be heard blocks away when fired, yet none of the neighbors reported hearing shots that night. And inside the house, no one seemed to have woken up after the first gunfire. As officers continued their work, Butch sat in the kitchen with several men who had come from Henry's bar. He cried, shook his head, and repeated that someone had murdered his family. To the officers, he seemed like the only surviving son in shock. Louise's father, Michael Brigante, arrived not long after. When he saw the house surrounded by police cars, his grief was overwhelming. He had helped buy this home for his daughter. Now, she and her entire family, except for Butch, were dead inside. Officers tried to calm him as he demanded answers. Detectives spoke with Butch in more detail. He explained that he had been at work that morning, that he had tried calling the house throughout the day, and that when he came back in the evening, no one answered the door. He said he had broken in through a kitchen window and found his parents dead. Then, terrified, he had run back to Henry's to get help. The detectives listened, but they knew the investigation had to move carefully. They kept Butch close while crime scene technicians began their work. More than 100 photographs were taken, showing each body, each room, and every angle. The house was treated like a puzzle that needed to be carefully pieced together. By the end of the night, the entire neighborhood knew what had happened. Word spread quickly through Amityville. 6 members of the DeFeo family were dead. Only the eldest son had survived. What no one yet realized was how quickly suspicion would shift. Through the long night, Suffolk County detectives worked carefully inside 112 Ocean Avenue. The house was quiet, except for the movements of investigators. Photographs were taken, evidence was collected, and each room was marked with detail. 6 lives had ended in the early hours of the morning, and now the task was to find out how. Butch DeFeo stayed close to the officers. At first, they treated him like a surviving victim, the only member of the family spared. He spoke quickly, sometimes nervously, telling them the same story he had shared at Henry's bar. He said he had gone to work early that morning. He claimed he had tried calling the house several times during the day, but no one picked up. When he returned home in the evening, the doors were locked. He said he climbed through a window, walked upstairs, and found his parents shot. Terrified, he ran straight back to the bar to get help. For hours, detectives listened, but as the details were written down, questions began to rise. Why had he only mentioned his parents at first, not his brothers and sisters? Why had he waited until the police arrived before saying there were more victims? His words seemed careful, but also incomplete. By the early morning hours of November 14th, detectives decided to move Butch from the house. They brought him to the station for formal questioning. He was placed in a room, and the interrogation began. At first, he kept to the same version. He blamed the murders on a mob hitman. He even gave them a name, Louis Fellini. According to Butch, Fellini was connected to organized crime, and he had broken into the house to kill the family. Butch insisted that Fellini had been angry with his grandfather's car dealership, which secretly did work for the mob. The detectives listened carefully, but they also knew the crime scene told a different story. Every victim had been shot at close range. There were powder burns on the skin, signs that the rifle had been fired only inches away. Whoever had pulled the trigger had been inside the rooms, standing over the beds. As they questioned him, detectives compared the evidence with Butch's story. They had already seen the gun box in his bedroom, an empty case for a .35 caliber Marlin rifle, the same type of weapon used in the murders. Ammunition was also found. But the rifle itself was missing. The picture was beginning to change. At the same time, the medical examiner confirmed the estimated time of death. The family had been killed around 3:15 a.m. Butch claimed he left for work very early that morning, around 6 o'clock. That meant he was home when the shots were fired. Piece by piece, his story began to fall apart. Detectives pressed harder. They asked him again and again about his movements. They confronted him with the fact that the victims had all been killed as they slept, that the murder weapon matched the one he owned, and that he had no explanation for the missing rifle. Under pressure, Butch changed his story. He leaned forward and said that Fellini had not only been there, but had forced him to take part. He claimed the mobster had held him at gunpoint and ordered him to shoot his family. He said once he started, he could not stop. It was a shocking admission, but it still did not fit. Detectives could tell he was shifting blame, trying to explain his role without confessing outright. Then, almost without warning, the final crack appeared. Butch told them where they could find the discarded clothes he had worn during the killings. He said he had thrown them into a storm drain on his way to work. When officers checked, they found blood-stained clothing and towels, just as he described. The truth was closing in. By November 14th, less than 24 hours after the discovery of the bodies, suspicion no longer rested on an unknown intruder. It was fixed on the one person who had survived inside 112 Ocean Avenue. Ronald DeFeo Jr. was no longer just the grieving son. He was now the prime suspect in the murders of his entire family. As the questioning continued, the Suffolk County detectives kept Butch under watch. His story had already shifted more than once. At first, he insisted he had nothing to do with the killings. Then, he blamed a mob hitman named Louis Fellini. Now he was admitting that he had handled the rifle, but only because, he said, Fellini had forced him. The detectives studied him carefully. They had already learned from the medical examiner that each victim had been shot at close range, with the rifle only inches from their bodies. They had also recovered the bloody clothing from the storm drain, exactly where Butch said it would be. The weight of the evidence was pointing in one direction. Still, Butch tried to build his story. He claimed Fellini had come into the house early in the morning carrying a gun. According to him, Fellini threatened him and ordered him to shoot his own family. But the detectives noticed something. Butch spoke quickly, almost rambling, and every time they pressed him for details, the story changed slightly. In one version, Fellini had done the shooting himself. In another, Fellini made Butch do it. In another, Butch said he blacked out and only remembered flashes of what happened. The more he spoke, the less believable his story became. The detectives then reminded him of the facts. The .35 caliber Marlin rifle that had been used belonged to him. They had found the box for it in his room. Ammunition for that rifle was also in the house, but the rifle itself was missing. Butch grew restless. He shifted in his chair, rubbed his face, and finally admitted something new. He said he had thrown the rifle into the Amityville River behind the house. He gave exact directions. When officers searched, they recovered the weapon. It was the same gun that had fired every bullet found in the bodies of his family. With that discovery, there was no turning back. Butch's stories grew even more tangled. Sometimes, he said he heard voices in his head, urging him to kill. Other times, he claimed his sister Dawn had been involved, that she had taken things too far, and that he killed her last after she shot the younger children. Then, he would pull back and change it again, saying he had acted alone. The detectives had seen this before, a suspect under pressure, trying to spread the blame, trying to cover his tracks. But every piece of physical evidence, the rifle, the bullets, the powder burns, the bloody clothing, pointed only to him. By November 14th, 1974, less than 2 days after the murders, Ronald Butch DeFeo Jr. was formally charged with 6 counts of second-degree murder. The news spread quickly. Reporters crowded outside the police station. Photographers snapped pictures as Butch was led past in handcuffs. He kept his head down, saying little. In Amityville, shock turned into disbelief. The neighbors who had watched the family move into the big white house on Ocean Avenue now whispered about the son who had killed them all. The house where the family had once dreamed of high hopes was now marked forever. And the trial ahead would reveal even more. About the violence inside the DeFeo home, about Butch's life of drugs and anger, and about the terrifying silence that surrounded the night of the murders. The boy who once took the beatings to shield his siblings was now accused of ending their lives. The arrest of Ronald Butch DeFeo Jr. shook the quiet village of Amityville. The newspapers called it one of the worst crimes Long Island had ever seen. A son accused of murdering his parents, his brothers, and his sisters, all while they slept in their beds. It was a story that seemed almost impossible, yet the evidence was overwhelming. In the months that followed, investigators continued to build their case. The rifle had been recovered from the Amityville River. The clothing and towels with blood had been found in the storm drain. The empty rifle box had been left in Butch's bedroom. Every bullet matched the weapon he owned. And the medical examiner confirmed the time of death, around 3:15 in the morning, when Butch himself admitted he had been awake inside the house. When the trial finally began on October 14th, 1975, the courtroom filled with reporters and curious onlookers. People wanted to hear for themselves how a man could kill 6 members of his own family. Butch sat at the defense table, his dark hair combed back, his expression often shifting between calm and restless. His defense team made their strategy clear from the start. They would argue that Butch was insane at the time of the murders. They said he heard voices in his head that told him to kill. They claimed he had a dissociative disorder, that he was out of touch with reality, and that he could not be held fully responsible for what happened that night. Psychiatrists were called to the stand. One expert for the defense explained that Butch suffered from severe mental illness. He said the voices Butch heard were real to him, and that in his unstable state, he could not control his actions. To the jury, the defense painted a picture of a man who was tormented, lost inside his own mind, and unable to resist the command to kill. But the prosecution countered with their own experts. Another psychiatrist testified that Butch did not suffer from psychosis at all. Instead, he was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. He was not insane, they argued. He was calculating, manipulative, and fully aware of what he was doing. The prosecution reminded the jury of the details. Butch had disposed of evidence. He had lied to the police about a mob hitman. He had shifted his stories again and again, trying to protect himself. Those were not the actions of a man who did not know right from wrong. They were the actions of someone trying to escape punishment. The jury listened as the weeks passed. Witnesses described the violence in the DeFeo home, the abuse from Ronnie Sr., and the troubled childhood Butch had endured. They heard how he had bullied classmates, how he had sunk into drugs, and how he had once pointed a gun at his father and pulled the trigger. They heard about the near stabbing when Dawn tried to protect her mother. It was clear the home had been filled with rage and fear, but the question remained, did that justify what happened on November 13th, 1974? When the closing arguments came, the prosecution was firm. They told the jury that Butch had motive. He hated his father. He lived in constant conflict with his family, and he wanted freedom from the control inside the house. He had the means, a rifle he owned and ammunition in his room, and he had shown guilt by discarding the weapon, hiding his clothes, and creating stories about mobsters and voices. On November 21st, 1975, the jury returned with their decision. They found Ronald Butch DeFeo Jr. guilty on 6 counts of second-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to 6 concurrent terms of 25 years to life in prison. The trial was over, but the questions remained. How could one man kill his entire family, and how had no one in the house woken up to the sound of the rifle? Why had the neighbors not heard gunshots from such a powerful weapon? And why did Butch continue to change his story, even after his conviction? Those questions would linger for decades, fueling speculation, books, and movies. But for the families of Amityville, one fact was clear. 6 people were dead, and the boy who once stood up to protect his siblings was the one who had destroyed them all. After the trial ended and the sentence was handed down, Butch DeFeo was moved into the prison system. He was taken to Green Haven Correctional Facility in upstate New York. There, he began serving his 6 sentences of 25 years to life. He was only 23 years old, and his future now stretched out behind bars. Green Haven was no ordinary prison. It held some of the most notorious criminals of the time. Butch found himself housed alongside men whose names would later become infamous in true crime history. Arthur Shawcross, the Genesee River Killer, was there. David Berkowitz, known as the Son of Sam, would later spend time in the same facility. Even serial killers like Andre Rand, the man linked to missing children on Staten Island, crossed paths inside the prison walls. Butch stood out among them, not because of the number of his victims, others had killed more, but because of the nature of his crime. He had wiped out his entire family in one night. That made him different, and it also made him a subject of endless fascination. Inside prison, he continued to talk. He granted interviews, sometimes eager to tell his side, sometimes cryptic, almost as if he enjoyed leaving people uncertain. His story kept changing. In one version, he said voices told him to kill. In another, he claimed his sister Dawn had been involved, and that she shot some of the siblings before he turned the gun on her. At other times, he denied hearing voices at all. saying instead that drugs had clouded his mind. The contradictions made it difficult to know what to believe. Even decades later, Butch never gave one clear version. Each time he spoke, the details shifted. Some believed this was his way of keeping control of the story, never allowing anyone to fully know the truth. Others thought it showed the unstable and manipulative personality the prosecution had argued about during the trial. Outside prison, the story of the DeFeo murders did not fade. The house at 112 Ocean Avenue drew more attention with each passing year. Neighbors complained of cars slowing down, tourists snapping pictures, and people staring at the large white house with the quarter-moon windows that looked like watchful eyes. The murders alone were enough to mark the house forever. But soon, another layer of legend would build on top of it. A new family, the Lutzes, would move into the house about a year after the trial. They would claim that what they experienced there was beyond explanation, that something evil lingered inside the walls where 6 people had died. Their story would spread quickly, becoming a book and later a film, turning the house into one of the most famous, haunted homes in the world. But at the heart of it all remained the real tragedy. 6 members of one family, Ronald Sr., Louise, Dawn, Allison, Mark and John, gone in a single night. And the man responsible, their own son and brother, sitting in prison, telling and retelling the story in ways that never quite lined up. The truth of what happened on November 13th, 1974, seemed locked away, not only behind prison bars, but also behind the mind of the only person who knew exactly how the night unfolded. And that uncertainty, those missing pieces, would keep the story alive for years to come. It was about 1 year after Butch DeFeo was sentenced when the large house at 112 Ocean Avenue found new owners. In December 1975, George and Kathy Lutz purchased the property for $80,000. It was considered a bargain, a 3-story Dutch colonial, 5 bedrooms, 3.5 bathrooms, a boathouse on the canal, and even a private dock. By most standards, it was a dream home, but the house carried a heavy shadow. 6 people had been murdered there only 13 months earlier. The DeFeo family's story was still fresh in the minds of Amityville residents. Neighbors whispered about it, some thinking no one would ever want to live there again. But the Lutzes believed they could make it their home. George and Kathy moved in with Kathy's 3 children from a previous marriage. They were young: Daniel, Christopher, and Melissa. Together, the family of 5 hoped to start a new chapter. They brought furniture, decorations, and plans for the future. But from the very first days, they claimed, things did not feel right. George spoke later about the cold. No matter how much he fed the fireplace, the house stayed icy. Kathy described a sense of being watched, as if unseen eyes followed them from room to room. The children began acting differently, quiet at times, unsettled at others. The family dog barked at empty corners, growling at something no one else could see. As days passed, the unease grew stronger. Doors slammed without reason. Strange odors drifted through rooms. George woke at exactly 3:15 every morning, the same time the DeFeo family had been killed. Kathy said she felt arms wrap around her at night, though no one was there. The children, too, spoke of odd experiences. Melissa told her parents about an imaginary friend named Jody, a pig-like creature with glowing red eyes. George said he once saw the eyes shining at him from outside the window. The family began to fear the house itself. George grew irritable and distant, his behavior changing as though something in the home had taken hold of him. Kathy reported having vivid dreams about the murders, seeing the bodies of the DeFeo family lying in their beds. The activity escalated quickly. Green slime oozed from walls, crucifixes twisted upside down. The family heard voices, whispers, and footsteps echoing through empty rooms. At times, the front door would fling open, though it was locked. It all built to a breaking point. On the 28th day after moving in, the Lutz family fled the house. They left in the middle of the night, taking only what they could carry. They never returned. When news of their story reached the public, it spread rapidly. A book was written about their experiences, titled The Amityville Horror. Soon after, a film was released. The house on Ocean Avenue became more than the site of a terrible crime. It became a symbol of haunting, a place people said was cursed. But for all the talk of ghosts, the truth remained the same. The horror of the house began not with spirits, but with a son who had turned on his family. The tragedy of November 1974 was the real shadow over Amityville. Everything else, the books, the movies, the legends, was built upon that single night. Still, the blending of fact and fear only made the story larger. People wanted to believe there was something evil inside the walls, something that explained why such violence had happened. And so the house stood, quiet on Ocean Avenue, its windows watching, its past never forgotten. After the Lutz family left 112 Ocean Avenue in January of 1976, the house once again became the focus of attention. Their story of fleeing after only 28 days spread quickly, and soon people from all over wanted to know what had happened inside. The book, The Amityville Horror, written by Jay Anson, was published in 1977. It told the story of the Lutzes in vivid detail. The cold spots, the voices, the slime, the red-eyed creature, and the terror that forced them out in the middle of the night. The book became a bestseller, turning the house into one of the most famous in the country. In 1979, the story reached even more people when the Amityville horror film was released. The movie was a success, and with it, the legend of the house grew. Sequels followed, each one adding new layers of haunting, each one drawing more visitors to the quiet street in Amityville. But for the neighbors who lived nearby, the constant attention was overwhelming. Cars slowed down daily, tourists stopped to take pictures, and some even walked onto the property uninvited. The white Dutch colonial with its quarter-moon windows became a landmark, though for reasons no one in the town wanted. The new owners after the Lutzes tried to live quietly. They made changes to the exterior, altering the look of the house so it would not be so recognizable. The famous eye windows were replaced with square ones, and the address was even changed from 112 Ocean Avenue to 108 Ocean Avenue. Still, people continued to find it. The reputation of the house was too strong to hide. Over the years, more families lived in the home. Some reported no strange activity at all, insisting it was just an ordinary house with an extraordinary history. Others said they felt uneasy, though not to the extreme of the Lutzes' claims. Debates grew. Was the haunting real, or had the Lutz family created the story for money and attention? Meanwhile, Butch DeFeo remained in prison. From time to time, he gave interviews. His words only added to the confusion. He claimed at different times that Dawn had fired some of the shots, that another man had been involved, or that he alone had done everything. He denied hearing voices, then later insisted the voices were real. He never gave one consistent truth, and this uncertainty fueled the mystery even more. For investigators and true crime followers, the murders were always the heart of the story. 6 members of the DeFeo family had died in their sleep. A rifle had been fired again and again inside the house, yet no neighbors reported hearing the shots. No one inside the home seemed to wake. That detail haunted people just as much as the ghost stories that came later. Through the 1980s and 1990s, the Amityville legend became part of American culture. Books, documentaries, and movies kept the story alive. The line between fact and fiction blurred. Some focused on the paranormal, others on the brutal crime, but both sides pointed back to the same house on Ocean Avenue. Even as years passed, the fascination did not fade. People still came to Amityville to look at the house, to stand on the street, to take pictures, and to imagine what had happened inside. For the town's residents, it was a constant reminder of a tragedy they wished they could forget. And yet the more time passed, the stronger the legend seemed to grow. Through the 1980s and 1990s, Ronald Butch DeFeo Jr. remained behind bars. He served his sentence at Green Haven Correctional Facility, and from there, he continued to speak to journalists, writers, and even filmmakers who reached out to him. Each time his story changed, and each version seemed to pull the truth further out of reach. In one interview, he said his sister Dawn had been the one who killed the younger siblings, and that he shot her in anger afterward. In another, He claimed Dawn and a friend had helped him, but things had gotten out of control. At other times, he went back to blaming voices in his head, telling reporters that strange whispers had pushed him to kill. Butch seemed unwilling, or perhaps unable, to settle on one version. For investigators who had worked the original case, it only confirmed what they had believed all along. He was manipulative, always changing his story to suit his needs, always keeping himself at the center of attention. Yet, for the public, his shifting words only deepened the mystery. People asked, was he trying to hide Dawn's role? Was he covering for someone else? Or was he simply lying, enjoying the attention his crime had brought him? While Butch remained in prison, the house in Amityville continued to attract curiosity. Owners came and went, each dealing with the unwanted spotlight that followed the address. Some said they never experienced anything unusual, that the so-called haunting was a story created to sell books and movies. Others admitted that the history of the place weighed heavily on them, even if nothing supernatural occurred. In time, the street itself grew weary of the attention. Neighbors often complained of cars parked outside, strangers wandering close to the property, and endless photographs being taken. The house became both famous and infamous, a landmark no one in Amityville really wanted. Through the years, documentaries revisited the case. Some focused on the murders themselves, breaking down the evidence, questioning how 6 people could be shot in their beds without waking. Others leaned into the supernatural, exploring the Lutz family's claims, repeating the chilling details of green slime, moving crucifixes, and glowing eyes in the dark. For the families of the victims, however, it was not a ghost story, it was a tragedy. Ronald Sr., Louise, Dawn, Allison, Mark, and John were gone. Their lives ended in one night. Relatives and neighbors carried that memory long after the news cameras left. By the 2000s, the case was still alive in the public imagination. Butch himself filed appeals from prison, trying to overturn his conviction, but none succeeded. He also gave more interviews, some of them contradictory within minutes. He said he had acted in self-defense, then later claimed the murders were planned, then once again spoke of voices. Each version left more questions than answers, but one fact never changed. 6 members of his family were dead, and he was the one convicted for their murders. As the decades passed, the Amityville story became both a true crime case and a cultural phenomenon. For some, it was a tale of family violence and tragedy. For others, it was proof of something darker, a haunting that lingered long after the murders. But beneath all the theories and all the legends, the truth remained locked inside the mind of Ronald DeFeo Jr., and he never gave it away fully. The years passed, but the memory of the murders inside 112 Ocean Avenue never faded. Ronald Butch DeFeo Jr. remained in prison, his name forever tied to one of the most infamous crimes in American history. From time to time, his voice would reach the outside world through interviews, but his words were always uncertain, shifting from one version to another. He never gave a single, steady truth. In prison, he continued to serve his 6 life sentences. He aged behind bars, no longer the young man who had once walked out of the Amityville house and cried for help at a bar down the street. His hair grew grey, his health began to fail, but his crime kept him a subject of discussion far beyond the prison walls. Meanwhile, the house itself carried its history into each new decade. Families lived there quietly, trying to ignore the stories that surrounded it, but the attention never stopped. Visitors still came to Amityville, drawn by the legend. They stood outside, took pictures, and whispered about what they thought had happened inside. For the neighbors, it became a constant reminder that the shadow of November 1974 would never truly lift. Books and films kept the story alive. The Amityville horror had grown into a franchise, with sequels and remakes, each one adding more layers of fiction on top of the original tragedy. Some films leaned heavily on the idea of haunting, while others tried to retell the murders themselves. But no matter how many times the story was recreated, the real victims remained the same. Ronald Sr., Louise, Dawn, Allison, Mark, and John. As the years stretched into decades, Butch never left prison. He was denied parole each time he applied. The courts did not believe his shifting stories, and the weight of the evidence against him never disappeared. Then, in March of 2021, word came from Albany that Ronald DeFeo Jr. had died in custody at the age of 69. His cause of death was not immediately made public, but his passing closed a chapter that had lasted nearly half a century. For some, his death brought a kind of ending. For others, it left the same questions hanging in the air, questions about how the murders really happened, about why no one woke during the gunfire, and about the truth behind his ever-changing confessions. But even with his death, the story did not end. The house on Ocean Avenue still stood, changed on the outside, but carrying the same history within. The debates continued. Was it simply a tragic case of family violence, or did something darker linger inside those walls? What began as one night of horror in 1974 had stretched into generations of mystery, legend, and fear. The crime itself was undeniable. 6 lives were lost, a family was destroyed, a community was shaken. And even now, decades later, the story of the Amityville murders remains one that people cannot look away from. The truth lies somewhere in the spaces between Butch's words, the investigator's evidence, and the silence of a house that saw it all. That silence still waits, holding secrets that no one will ever fully unlock. This was the story of the DeFeo family murders and the long shadow they left over the house in Amityville. A tragedy that began with abuse, ended with bloodshed, and still raises questions to this day. 6 lives lost in one night, and a story that never faded, even decades later. If this story moved you, if you listened until the end, don't just close the video and walk away. Share it with someone you know, because history like this should never be forgotten. And make sure you subscribe so you can hear the next true story when it arrives. Your support helps keep these stories alive.